The parole hearing of convicted killer Oscar Pistorius will get underway in Pretoria today. The former Paralympian shot and killed his girlfriend, Reeva Steenkamp, on Valentine's Day in 2013. For more on this, we're now joined by legal expert advocate Deon Pool. Advocate, appreciate your time this morning. Your opinion on the potential release of Oscar Pistorius?
Good morning, Hugo. As far as my recollection is, this is the first time that Oscar will be considered for parole. In our dispensation, once you have served 50% of your time, it's an automatic process that you then become eligible for parole. You don't have a right to parole, you only become eligible for parole, and then the process kicks in automatically. There are various reports that are compiled by members of the DCS, and of course we have a victim centralized system where the family of a victim, also their opinions are taken into consideration. You would have had that experience with Janus Vallus, specifically in respect of the Crisani family that were given that opportunity and exercised it. So in this instance, it would be the first time that he's being considered for parole, which is a right that he has, is to be considered. He can make representations, various other people can make representations on his behalf, and of course they can also attend this, not so much a hearing as what it is, a meeting, where all of these issues can then be considered and a decision can be made. Personally, I'm of the view that Mr. Pistorius may not qualify for parole at this point in time, given the nature of the offence that was committed, which is an aspect that ought to be taken into account. If one looks at specifically, I believe it was the Patla decision out of the Constitutional Court that when the new Act came into operation, the court said that you must not particularly look at comments that were made by the presiding officer at the time the sentence was passed, but more concentrate on what the current circumstances are that a person would have to expect in order to be reintegrated into society. But we are, or not but at least, but we are freshly down the line in the sense that if I stand corrected, but I'm under the impression that he got 13 and a half years that he has to serve. So half of that would be about between 6 and 7. So I do not think that at this point in time that he would automatically qualify for parole. I think it may still be a bit premature, although it is his right. But that is a personal view.
Well, let's talk about what the parole board will be looking at.
Well, as I mentioned, the parole board looks at various factors. Those factors are usually incorporated in various reports. One of those reports is prepared by members of the department themselves, their probation officers, being social workers, members that deal with parolees in order, is Mr. Pistorius monitorable? Is he a candidate that can be trusted with parole conditions? Where will he go and live? Who is he going to live with? All of those circumstances will be taken into consideration. And then the fact that he was a first offender at the time that he was sentenced, they will take into consideration the nature of the offence, to what extent any violence may have been perpetrated during the offence, the nature of the violence perpetrated.
Well, in this instance, Advocate Pool, if you allow me, he shot Reeva Steenkamp, his girlfriend, through the door, right? So is that considered a huge measure of violence?
Well, it all depends on the, objectively speaking, it will depend on the nature of the circumstances surrounding the infliction of violence. I can shoot at you through the door because I'm simply purely malicious. In this instance, I don't particularly think that is what the court found eventually. But it depends on the nature and the circumstances related to the violence. So they will take into consideration the circumstances that led to the offence as we understand it. And then, of course, the family, they have the right to make certain representations because they are eventually the people who were affected to a certain or to a large extent by this incident. The family of Mr. Pistorius, their views will be taken into consideration. So it's a multifaceted consideration that is placed before the parole board. And the parole board is mainly made up of members of society, and then, of course, a senior member of the Department of Corrections, possibly a member of the police, and possibly a member of the National Prosecuting Authority. I don't know in what way the parole board will be constituted today, but for the purposes of the decision that needs to be made is once again the spotlight is on this case. So it will be something that will be followed very closely by every member of the public, given the status in the public domain that this matter has enjoyed over the years.
Is that board, advocate, public? Do we know who those individuals are?
No, I'm not sure who the individuals are at this point in time.
But will that information become available?
Yes,
the reason I ask is
it
because
will become available.
I'd like to know if subjectivity plays a role, because you've just said that they're members of society who I'd imagine would have their own biases of sorts.
I think the understanding is, of course, that nobody, Justice Cameron said in a judgment that no particular person enters a courtroom or is elevated to the status of deciding a matter, arrives there as a societal virgin. You know, we do each have a background, we do each have a view, we do each have a bias or a prejudice or a premise or a preference. At the end of the day, the decision that must be made must be rational. And it must confirm with the principles of objectivity and rationality. If they don't, of course, you have the mechanism that the Act provides, is that you can complain and it gets referred to the Parole Review Board. Alternatively, of course, you can go to the court, like Mr. Valus did, and eventually have it dealt with by the highest court in the land to the extent that it is relevant or necessary. So it is a requirement, irrespective of how a person may feel about it. Feelings don't really play a role. It must be a decision that is made premised on the facts.
Now, final thoughts. How do cases like Pistorius's affect public perception of the criminal justice system? Particularly, I mean, you talked about Janusz Walusz, for instance, as an example, where there was a massive, massive outcry. Your take in this particular case?
Well, understandably, we were given Mr. Pistorius's public image at the time of the incident. It did draw a lot of attention. And the matter was televised, the trial was televised, which put South Africa very much in the forefront of international jurisprudence. And then, of course, the subsequent appeals that followed from that. So I think the fact that these matters are not so much televised, but that they draw the amount of the attention that they do, it provides the public with information to see practically or experience practically how our jurisprudence is working on the ground, because it sometimes looks wonderful on paper, but in practice it doesn't particularly work that way, and the reality between the written law and the practice of law is sometimes far between what you would expect, and it's important that the general public understand that these are the processes that apply, and also the transparency that is related thereto, so that when a decision is made, you know why the decision has been made to a certain extent. And you can feel safe with the fact that our justice system works in a democratic society as to be expected.
The Oscar Pistorius parole hearing begins today. Legal expert advocate Deon Pool, thank you for your expert opinion this morning.